My parents chose my sister's dog over me. It happened during a stormy week in November. I was 32, single, and living alone in Portland, Oregon. My name is Emma Watson, and I worked as a senior emergency response coordinator for the city. While most people ran away from crisis, I coordinated who ran toward it. I tracked fire trucks, ambulances, helicopters. My days were a blur of clipped radio calls, accident maps, and dispatch codes. And at night, I returned to a 2-bedroom apartment that felt quieter than it should. I didn't party. I didn't date much. Most of my energy was saved for people who didn't save anything for me. And still, I kept showing up at family dinners, for holiday cooking, for pet-sitting duties, for repairs and bills no one else wanted to deal with in my family. Responsibility wasn't divided. It just quietly landed on my shoulders, and everyone pretended that was normal. My sister Chloe, on the other hand, was the sun around which everything orbited. She was younger than me by 5 years and had grown up beautiful, clever, and completely aware of it. She had a lifestyle blog with a decent following, a handsome boyfriend who used to be mine back in college, and a white husky named Tyson that she dressed in designer jackets and fed gourmet dog meals. My mom, Melinda, adored her. My dad, Daniel, traveled often and didn't see the daily dynamics. I can't blame him entirely. He assumed we were close, that Chloe and I were just different, but in truth, she barely saw me unless she needed something. The week before it happened, Mom called to ask if I could stay at their place while Chloe flew to New York for a holiday campaign shoot. The house needed someone to water the plants, walk Tyson, and prep the guest room for a dinner party that weekend. I said yes. I always said yes, even when I had back-to-back shifts, even when I hadn't had a proper day off in 2 weeks. No one asked if I was tired. They assumed I could handle it. I always did. That Friday, I pulled a 30-hour shift after a pileup on the interstate. When I finally clocked out, the city was soaked in cold rain. I drove home slowly, blinking back exhaustion. My phone rang Mom. "Don't forget Tyson's walk tonight. He hasn't gone since lunch," she said cheerfully. And Chloe said the rosemary's wilting again. I said I'd take care of it and hung up. Then everything went black. They said the delivery truck had lost control at the intersection. Witnesses said the impact lifted my car off the road and slammed it against a utility pole. I was pulled out unconscious. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, collapsed lung. I don't remember the ambulance. I don't remember the first surgeries. What I do remember is the cold, not from the air, but from the silence that followed. I was listed in critical condition, barely hanging on. When the hospital called my emergency contact, my mother, her response was recorded in the patient log. "I'm sorry. I can't come right now. I'm walking my daughter's dog. Maybe later this afternoon." Those were her words. My mother told a nurse I was in critical condition and bleeding internally. And her answer was that Tyson needed his routine. And later that day, she and Chloe went to the airport. I wouldn't have known that if it weren't for Olivia Lane, my colleague and closest friend. She visited when no one else did, brought me clean socks, and whispered updates between surgeries. It was she who tried to call my dad, but Mom had listed herself as sole emergency contact. It was Olivia who stayed with me when I woke up the first time and asked with a cracked whisper, "Has anyone from my family come?" She hesitated before shaking her head. By the time Chloe and Mom showed up 2.5 days after the accident, I was already conscious. Although too weak to speak, I saw them through half-lidded eyes, bags from Bloomingdale's in hand, asking how long the visit would take. I remember Mom saying softly, "Don't tell your father. It'll stress him out." Then they left. 15 minutes, That was all they gave me. That night, as the morphine wore off and the machines beeped steadily around me, a single thought settled into my chest like an anchor. If I had died, Tyson would have gotten more attention than I did. The next morning, Olivia sat beside me while the sun filtered through the blinds. My throat burned every time I tried to speak, so I mostly listened. She read aloud notes from my coworkers, left on a corkboard someone had pinned above my bed. Some were funny, others practical. A few mentioned they'd covered my shifts and to rest up. Hero. But not one card or message from my family, nothing from my mother, nothing from Chloe. Not even a simple get well soon. My phone had been destroyed in the crash, and no one had tried to reach me through the hospital. Olivia told me they asked once whether I'd be home by the weekend because Chloe had an influencer brunch she didn't want to miss. I asked her to stop reading after that. I couldn't cry. My body hurt too much. 2 more days passed, and I began walking short distances with help. I was still on oxygen. My ribs were wrapped, and I moved like a broken puppet. But I was conscious, awake enough to recognize a truth I hadn't wanted to admit before. No one was coming, at least not for me. They came for the optics, to keep up appearances, to check the box labeled daughter. But love didn't look like 15-minute visits. Love didn't sound like complaints about hospital parking. Love didn't leave you gasping through pain alone in a white room while strangers held your hand and your mother ignored her phone. That evening, I asked Olivia to help me send a message to my father. His number wasn't listed on any hospital records, which confused me. I knew he was traveling, but he always checked in. I gave her the name of his company, a rough itinerary I remembered from before the accident, and watched her face tighten as she searched. "Emma," she said carefully, "your dad isn't in Amsterdam. He's in Singapore for a 3-week trip, not 3 months. That's what his assistant said when I finally got through." I stared at her, numb. Mom told me he was gone for a quarter, that he wouldn't have signal, that contacting him would just stress him out. None of it made sense. That night, after Olivia left, I forced myself to sit upright and write. My hand shook, but I managed a few clean words on the hospital notepad. Dad doesn't know. Why? Then I asked for a phone. The nurse said I wasn't allowed to use one unsupervised yet. So I waited. I waited until they turned the lights down, until my body could take it. And then I signed discharge forms without anyone knowing. The nurse protested, but I insisted. It was reckless. I didn't care. By midnight, I was outside the house I'd grown up in, wrapped in 2 layers of coats and barely able to stand. I still had hospital tape on my arm. I didn't knock. I had the old garage code memorized. Inside. The lights were off except in the living room. I heard voices. Soft. Too soft for television. Familiar. But not to each other. I took 2 steps forward and froze when I heard Mom laugh. Not her usual high-pitched social laugh. This one was quiet, private. She said something about Dad's return date being pushed back. A man's voice replied, "That gives us more time, doesn't it?" I backed away from the hallway and found myself by the front office. The landline was still there. I picked it up and dialed my dad's Hong Kong office line. It rang 3 times before someone answered. I left no details, just a message. "This is Emma. Please have him call me back directly. It's urgent." Then I hung up. On the way out, I stopped at the kitchen. Mom had left her iPad on the counter. Unlocked. Curiosity wasn't the right word. It was instinct. I checked the message threads. The top one was labeled JB, Joseph Baker, a name I'd only heard once, years ago, as someone Mom used to know. The texts weren't friendly, They were intimate. Hotel bookings, wine orders, discussions about Chloe's graduation. And then I found a thread that shook me to the bone. "Don't worry," Mom had written. "Daniel still believes Chloe is his. The tests are buried." I left the house in silence and walked 2 blocks before calling Olivia. My voice barely worked, but I asked her one thing. "Can you help me print something?" She said yes without asking what. At 4 a.m, I was back in her apartment, sitting on the edge of her futon, whispering plans. I wanted to write a letter. I wanted to send everything I found: photos, screen captures, emails to one address, Dad's. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't want drama. I just wanted him to know that I almost died and no one told him, that his wife lied to his face, that his daughter, the one he always believed was his, was not, and that the only person who had treated me like family was a nurse named Olivia who made sure I didn't die alone. By dawn, the envelope was sealed. I watched Olivia take it to the corner mailbox, her silhouette small in the fog. For the first time in days, I exhaled without pain. 3 days after mailing the envelope, I returned to the hospital for a final evaluation. My bruises were fading, though my body still moved like it belonged to someone else. Jennifer, the trauma surgeon who'd overseen my care, gave me the all-clear to continue recovery at home, provided I had help. I told her I did. I didn't mention that home wasn't where I planned to go. I couldn't sleep in that house again, not with memories of Chloe's perfume in the hallway and the sound of my mother's laughter echoing behind closed doors. I moved into Olivia's spare room. It was small, cluttered, and smelled faintly of old textbooks and lavender laundry sheets. But it was the only place I'd felt safe in weeks. I didn't tell anyone where I was. My mother texted once, asking if I was feeling better. No follow-up, no offer to help. Chloe left a voice message that sounded like she was reading from a script. "Sorry about everything. Hope you're recovering. Let us know when you're back." I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on building strength again. I walked every morning with a cane Olivia found at Goodwill. I sat in quiet cafes and wrote in a journal I hadn't touched in years. I tracked my medications and learned how to sleep without the hospital monitor beeping in my ear. I stopped trying to earn anyone's love. It was strange how quiet life became when you stopped begging to be seen. A week later, Olivia handed me her phone. Her face was unreadable. "It's your dad," she said. I answered slowly, pressing the phone to my ear with both hands. "Emma," he said, his voice tight. "I just got home. Where are you?" I told him I was safe, that I wasn't in the hospital anymore. He exhaled, long and hard. "I didn't know," he whispered. I had no idea. I believed him. His voice cracked in places it never had before. He didn't ask why I hadn't called sooner. He didn't accuse or defend. He just listened as I explained how I'd almost died, and no one thought to tell him. I told him about the texts, the emails, the voices in the living room. I heard him go silent. When he spoke again, he said 5 words I'll never forget: "I'm coming to fix this." That night, I couldn't sleep, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I realized I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been. What I felt was cleaner than that, like I'd set down a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying since childhood. I didn't need revenge. I just needed freedom. The next afternoon, Olivia and I stopped by my old house while my mother and sister were away. I left a single white envelope on the bed in the guest room. It was addressed simply, "For Melinda Watson." Inside was a letter, printed carefully, with everything she'd refused to hear. It described what it felt like to be bleeding and alone, to be ignored by the one person who should have shown up. It detailed the pain of being second place to a dog, of watching your own mother prioritize a leash over a life. And at the bottom, I signed my name, not as daughter, but as Emma, a woman choosing not to belong anymore. Dad called 2 days later. He had arrived home early. As promised, he said the house was a mess. Half-packed suitcases in the hallway. Unopened mail scattered on the floor. He had walked into the kitchen and found Mom sitting silently at the counter, the letter still clutched in her hand. She didn't speak. Chloe avoided him entirely. He found her later in the guest room, crying quietly. She didn't know either. He said, "About the DNA." I stayed silent. He continued, "Emma, I want to be where you are." The next morning, he showed up at Olivia's apartment with a small suitcase and tired eyes. I hadn't seen him like that since I was a teenager. He hugged me for a long time, like he'd been underwater and had finally reached the surface. He told me everything, how Mom had lied to him for years, how she'd manipulated his schedule, erased messages, and convinced him not to worry about my absence. He had replayed the recordings, read the printed emails, seen the test results with his own eyes. 29 years of marriage, he said quietly. And all it took was one envelope to undo it. I didn't reply. Some silences are sacred. That weekend, he filed for divorce. There was no yelling, no drama, just paperwork and stillness. I watched him sign the documents at a small wooden desk in a lawyer's office while rain fell against the windows. Chloe never contacted me again. Mom sent a single email with 2 lines. "I hope you're happy. You ruined everything." I didn't reply. She was wrong. I didn't ruin anything. I revealed what was already broken. After the divorce papers were filed, Dad stayed with me in Olivia's apartment for a few weeks. It wasn't ideal. The space was cramped, and the air mattress we borrowed deflated slightly each night. But neither of us complained. I cooked basic meals. He fixed a leaky faucet in the kitchen. Some evenings, we didn't talk much at all, but it was the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. For the first time in years, I felt like someone had chosen me without obligation, without strings, without guilt. And strangely, we both laughed more in those quiet weeks than we ever had in the house we used to call home. The fallout hit Chloe and Mom fast. Joseph Baker's name had surfaced in the divorce proceedings. His wife found out shortly after and kicked him out. From what Dad told me, Joseph disappeared within days, taking with him the last illusion of security Mom had built around her. Chloe tried to call him, but he blocked her. She then tried to track down her biological father, but no one returned her emails. Mom's credit cards were frozen, pending investigation into joint assets, and she had to leave the house when Dad officially moved back in. Chloe followed, since she had no income independent of brand sponsorships that quickly dried up once the family scandal leaked online through a cousin's Facebook post. The same cousin who had once begged Chloe for a shout-out suddenly shared the court filings with a caption that read, "Blood doesn't make you loyal." I didn't take pleasure in their collapse. I didn't smile when I heard they were staying in a rented apartment above a pet grooming salon, surviving off leftovers and freelance gig work. But I didn't feel sorry either. There's a kind of quiet justice in watching people who made you invisible become invisible to the world that once admired them. Dad never gloated. He never raised his voice, never said "I told you so." He simply went to work, came home, and rebuilt his life piece by piece with me beside him. We found a small townhouse near a quiet park in northeast Portland. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, old floorboards, windows that creaked in the wind. But it was ours. We picked out furniture together from local thrift shops. Olivia helped us paint the walls a soft sage green that made the space feel warmer. My room overlooked the street. His overlooked the backyard, where squirrels danced across a crooked fence every morning. I planted rosemary and basil in a tin box on the kitchen windowsill, not because we needed them, but because I could. No one would scold me if I forgot to water them. No one would demand I make dinner at the last minute or guilt me for missing a Sunday brunch. Dad started working remotely for a logistics company. I negotiated reduced hours with my department so I could ease back into emergency coordination without burning out. Olivia visited often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit in silence with us. She never asked for credit, never made it about herself. One afternoon, she brought over 2 photo frames. In one, a candid shot of me in the hospital, hooked up to machines, barely conscious, with her hand wrapped around mine. In the other, the same pose months later, but I was sitting up, smiling, gripping her hand back. She said, "I thought you should see both. What survival looks like before and after." It was that moment I realized my story wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about survival, not in the dramatic, heroic way people sometimes overuse the word, but in the quiet, persistent way you learn to breathe through pain. You learn to choose people who choose you, and you stop fighting for attention in places that only ever gave you crumbs. I didn't block my mother or Chloe. I didn't send them any warnings or declarations. I simply stopped showing up. The last message I received from my mother was a forwarded link to a job listing. It didn't say hello. It didn't ask how I was healing. It just read, "You might be a fit for this." I deleted it without opening the link. That's when I knew she still didn't understand. She thought I needed work. What I had needed was family, and I already had that now. Late one evening, while I was closing the blinds, Dad came into the kitchen holding a thick brown envelope. It was postmarked 2 weeks ago. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a USB drive. The note was short. I was wrong. About everything. I hope someday you'll let me explain. M. I turned the USB in my hand for a while, then placed it back in the envelope. I didn't need to know what was on it. I already knew enough. I dropped the envelope in the trash without a word. A few days after tossing the envelope, I went for a walk alone for the first time since the accident. The wind was sharper than I expected, but it kept me awake in a way that wasn't unpleasant. I walked without direction, passing the edge of the park, then the coffee shop where Olivia had once brought me a sandwich in a paper bag labeled with a smiley face. I stopped in front of the old Rescue Coordination Center, the one I hadn't returned to since stepping away. The building looked the same gray, slightly outdated, windows fogged from the inside, but I felt different, for the first time. I didn't feel like I owed that place all of me. I didn't owe anyone anything anymore. Later that night, Dad and I had dinner in the quiet kitchen. He made pasta with way too much garlic, and I let it slide. After we cleared the dishes, he asked if I wanted to read a letter he had received. I asked from whom. He said, "Chloe." He unfolded it and slid it across the table. I scanned it quickly. It was long, rambling, and written in handwriting I recognized from childhood birthday cards. There were apologies, questions, and a strange kind of sadness that didn't seem rehearsed. At the end, she wrote, "I don't know who I am without the story we were told." I handed it back without commenting. He said quietly, "She didn't know the truth. Not about you, not about him. She was raised on the same lies we were. I didn't disagree, but I wasn't ready to forgive her either. Some truths take longer to settle than others. That week, I opened my laptop and began drafting a personal essay. Not for attention, not for exposure, but for clarity. I titled it, What Survives? It wasn't about the crash. It wasn't about my mother or Chloe. It was about what remained when you stopped trying to belong in places that only ever tolerated you. I wrote about my body healing, about the silence of recovery, about the sting of being second choice to a leash in a brunch appointment. I wrote about Olivia sitting beside me through every long night, and about my father, standing in my doorway, suitcase in hand, asking to be near me again. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The truth has a tone you can't fake. 2 weeks later, the essay was published in a quiet corner of a trauma recovery blog. It didn't go viral. It didn't need to, but it found the right people. One woman emailed me to say she had walked herself to the ER after her mother hung up mid-sentence. Another said she kept a copy in her nightstand to read when her own doubts crept back. I read every message. I replied to most of them. I never said I'm sorry that happened. I just said, I understand. Spring came earlier than expected. The rosemary on our windowsill bloomed without warning, and the air began to soften. Dad painted the porch railing on a Sunday morning, while I sat nearby with a book I wasn't really reading. Olivia came by with a second-hand desk and helped me set up a writing nook by the window. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't social media perfect. But it felt like something I had built, piece by piece, without apology. One afternoon, while reorganizing some old files, I came across a folder labeled Tyson. It was full of documents from when I'd taken him to the vet months earlier for Chloe, vaccination records, grooming receipts, even a prescription for dog anxiety medication. I stared at the label for a while, then closed the folder, not with anger, just with clarity. That was the life I'd lived for years, filing other people's problems, keeping the receipts, doing the errands no one thanked me for. But that chapter was done. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, Dad looked at me and asked if I ever thought about moving. Not running away, but starting fresh in a different place. I considered it for a moment. The idea of a new city, new skyline, new streets without old memories felt inviting. But I shook my head. Not yet. I said, I'm not done being here, not until I've fully lived here as me. He nodded like he understood, and I knew he did. We ate in silence for a while. Then he said, almost to himself, she always thought she could control the story, but you told the truth in the quietest way. I didn't answer. I just passed him the garlic bread. A few weeks after the article went live, I received a call from someone at the city's Office of Emergency Planning. It wasn't a number I recognized, but the voice was familiar. It belonged to Marcy, a former supervisor who'd quietly stepped down after a scandal involving budget mismanagement. She asked if we could meet for coffee, said it wasn't official, just a conversation. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. We met at a small cafe near the river, where the tables were too close together and the windows always fogged up by noon. She looked thinner than I remembered, but not weaker. We sat, we ordered, we talked. She said she'd read my piece, said it had circulated quietly among people in the department. She didn't ask about the accident. She asked about the truth underneath it. I told her about the long nights and the quiet mornings, about the shift in me that no one else could see, about the way losing everything made room for something better. She said the department was restructuring again, that there might be room for someone who knew the work and understood the cost of it. She didn't offer me a job. She offered me a choice. I took a breath, told her I'd think about it. She smiled like she already knew the answer. Back home, I told Dad. He said the decision was mine, and whatever I chose, it would be the right one. I appreciated that more than I could explain. In the end, I said yes, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I finally had the space to do the work without being erased by it. My first day back wasn't dramatic. No one clapped. No one made speeches. Olivia left a sticky note on my desk that said, "You came back stronger." That was enough. Meanwhile, word reached us that Chloe had moved to Seattle. She'd found a temp job managing the front desk at a local gym. Dad forwarded me a message she sent him, asking if I'd consider reaching out. I didn't reply. I didn't hate her. I didn't wish her pain. But there's a difference between healing and reopening. I had chosen the first, and I intended to protect it. One afternoon, while updating our dispatch system, I overheard two junior coordinators talking. One of them said, "Did you hear the story about the woman whose mom chose a dog over her?" The other replied, "That can't be real." I didn't interrupt. I didn't clarify. I simply saved the file I was working on and moved to the next task. Not everything needs to be corrected. Some stories just need to live quietly for the ones who recognize them. That night, Dad made his signature overly peppered chili, and we ate on the back porch as the sky turned a dusty gold. He asked if I ever thought I'd end up here. I shook my head. "Not like this," I said. He nodded slowly and said, "But better." "Right," I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "It's not better or worse. It's just finally mine." We didn't talk much after that. The wind picked up, and I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a dog bark. It didn't sting the way it once did. It was just background noise now, a memory without weight. I smiled to myself, thinking about how far I'd come from the night I lay in that hospital room, waiting for a face that never arrived. That weekend, Olivia hosted a dinner at her apartment, just 6 of us, her, me, Dad, and a few close colleagues. Nothing extravagant. Spaghetti, salad, too much wine. Someone lit candles. Someone played old soul music in the background. At one point, I looked around the table and realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. No notifications, no family group chats, no passive-aggressive texts asking for favors, just real voices, real presence. After dessert, Olivia handed me a small box. Inside was a necklace with a tiny compass pendant. She said quietly, "So you never lose your way again." I didn't cry. I just nodded, slipping it around my neck and resting my hand on its weight. I whispered, "Thank you," she said. "For surviving or for starting over," I said. "Both." Later, walking home with Dad under the streetlights, he said, "You know, when I saw your name on that envelope in Hong Kong, I thought it was a birthday letter. I never imagined what was inside." I said, "Neither did I." Then I added, "But I'm glad you opened it." He looked at me and said, "That letter didn't destroy the family. It revealed the one worth keeping." As the weeks turned into months, the shape of my life slowly shifted from recovery to quiet ownership. I didn't announce my return to anything. I didn't post updates. I didn't tell extended family where I had moved or what I was doing. I simply lived. I watered the herbs on the windowsill and repainted the spare room one weekend with Olivia. I watched Dad build a small bench from old reclaimed wood he'd kept in storage for years and helped him carry it out to the porch. The days passed without tension or expectation, and in their place came a sense of steadying, that I hadn't known I was missing. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden, but it was real. On a Tuesday afternoon, I received an unexpected message through the blog that had published my essay. It was from a woman named Gwen, who introduced herself as someone who used to know my mother. She said she had read my piece and thought she recognized the story. Her words were measured, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure if reaching out was appropriate. She said she remembered my mom from their old neighborhood, recalled how often Melinda had kept to herself, but always spoke of her daughters like achievements. Gwen apologized if the message crossed a line. She ended with a short sentence I found myself reading twice. Some people confuse image with love. I hope you found the real thing. I didn't reply, but I thought about it for days. That idea that image could be mistaken for love fit so precisely into what I had grown up believing. That if you showed up, did everything right, smiled in photos, wore the right clothes, no one could accuse you of lacking care. But image is quiet when you're sick. It doesn't hold your hand through the night. It doesn't call the ambulance or sit beside you during surgery. Love does. And love isn't performative. It's patient. It's mundane. It's inconvenient and persistent and painfully ordinary in the best way. In early May, I returned to the hospital for a final set of scans. Jennifer, the trauma surgeon who had once whispered encouragement beside my bed, welcomed me back with a hug that felt more like a sister's than a colleague's. She asked how things were. I told her they were quiet, but good. She said I looked healthier, lighter, like someone who had finally stopped apologizing. I laughed, but she wasn't wrong. At the end of the appointment, she gave me a printed report and said, "You're clear. Everything's healed better than expected. You're lucky." I looked at her and said, "No, I'm ready." That night, Dad grilled vegetables on the porch while I called Olivia to tell her the news. She asked if we were celebrating. I said yes, but not with a party, just with space, that weekend. We cleared out the garage, not out of necessity, but as a gesture. We found old boxes labeled Emma's School Projects, full of faded posters and half-broken crafts. Most had never been displayed. I set them aside and didn't say anything. In one corner, I found a crate of holiday decorations I remembered unpacking every year while Chloe posed for photos. I left those sealed. At the bottom of one stack, I found a manila envelope with my name in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an old birthday card from when I was 13. No message, just a generic printed greeting and her signature. No memory attached, no scribbled note, no inside joke. It looked like something you buy in bulk and forget to personalize. I stared at it for a moment before sliding it back in and placing the envelope on top of the sealed holiday box. Then I closed the crate and didn't open it again. That night, while sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea, Dad asked if I ever felt angry. I said sometimes. Then I added, but it's not the kind that wants payback. It's the kind that wants space. He nodded and said, that's the healthiest kind. We sat in silence for a while before he said something that stayed with me. You're the only person in this family who ever knew how to love without needing credit. I didn't respond. I just reached across the table and placed my hand over his. We didn't need to say anything more. A few days later, I took down the last of the hospital paperwork from the bulletin board above my desk. I replaced it with a simple photo, me, Dad, and Olivia, standing outside the townhouse in spring light, no filters, no captions, just 3 people who chose each other when it mattered, people who showed up, who stayed, who didn't need permission to love properly. That was the only kind of family I ever wanted. In mid-June, I was invited to speak at a small training session for new emergency response recruits. The coordinator, a former colleague named Sam, said they wanted someone who understood not just the system, but the cost of being inside it. I hesitated at first. Public speaking had never been something I sought. I'd spent most of my career working behind scenes, connecting others, staying out of the spotlight. But something in me said yes, not for the recognition, for the message, for the quiet ones in the room who might one day face a silence like mine. That morning, I stood in a modest conference room with 20 chairs arranged in uneven rows. No podium, no microphone, just me, a laptop, and a room full of people who were still deciding if this career would consume them or shape them. I didn't talk about policy. I didn't use graphs or protocols. I told them about a night when a citywide blackout overloaded every channel and we had to decide which lives got answered first. I told them about my own accident, how I lay in the same hospital I used to coordinate for, listening for footsteps that never came. I ended by saying that in this work, the most important person you protect isn't always out there. Sometimes it's you. No one clapped when I finished, and I liked that. It meant they were still thinking. Later, a woman named Maria came up to thank me. She said she had a complicated family too, that it helped hearing someone speak without bitterness. I told her pain doesn't have to become a weapon. It can just become a choice. She smiled and wrote something in a small notebook before hurrying off. That night, Dad made dinner again, this time his attempt at Thai curry, which came out more like spicy soup. Olivia came by with ice cream and her latest thrift store find, a vintage teapot with a chipped lid. She said it was perfect, like us, and I couldn't disagree. We talked late into the night, not about the past, but about where to hang new shelves and whether we should start a little community garden in the alley behind our building. It felt like a life I had built from scratch, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I finally had the space to build it right. A few days later, a letter arrived at the townhouse. The envelope was pale pink with rounded edges, the kind you only find in boutique paper stores. I didn't need to look at the handwriting to know it was from Chloe. Dad saw it first. He handed it to me without comment and went back to fixing the crooked drawer in the hallway. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time before I opened it. Her writing was neater than I remembered. She said she'd been in therapy, said she was trying to understand the difference between being loved and being admired. She wrote that she hadn't known the full story, and that it didn't excuse her absence, but she wanted me to know she regretted it deeply. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask to meet. She ended simply with, "I hope you're okay now. I hope you feel loved." I folded the letter and slid it into the back of a drawer. I didn't feel anger, only distance. Some bridges don't need to burn. They just don't need to be crossed again. That was enough. That weekend, I returned to the park I used to walk through on my commute. The path had changed slightly. New benches, trimmed hedges, but the quiet hum of wind between the trees was the same. I sat for a while on one of the new benches, watching families pass by, some walking dogs, others pushing strollers. A little girl dropped her balloon and it floated up into the branches. She looked ready to cry, but her older brother knelt beside her and said something I couldn't hear, whatever it was. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and kept walking. I thought of that balloon later that evening, how sometimes things float out of reach and we waste so much energy trying to retrieve them when maybe we're meant to keep walking. I never got closure from my mother. I never got a real apology or an explanation that made any emotional sense. but I didn't need it anymore. Closure isn't always a door closing. Sometimes it's the decision not to knock anymore. Back at the townhouse, the light was soft in the kitchen, and Dad had already started boiling water for tea. Olivia was humming an old tune from the 70s, completely off key, and the whole space felt worn in and human. I set down my bag, kicked off my shoes, and took a deep breath. I didn't think about what I had lost. I thought about what I had protected, about what survived when the rest fell apart. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I had finally come home. Summer settled in like a quiet guest who didn't knock. The city grew warmer, the air thicker, and life kept moving, whether I noticed or not. I didn't make big plans. I didn't change my hair or go on long trips to find myself. I went to work. I watered the plants. I read books without finishing them. Some days were heavy, some were slow, but none of them were performative. I was no longer performing the role of the dutiful daughter or the invisible backbone of a family that only remembered I existed when something needed to be cleaned, cooked, or carried. I had finally stopped trying to earn a space that never belonged to me. At the coordination center, a few people started calling me the calm one. It wasn't because I had the right answers or moved faster. It was because I listened. I didn't react to everything. I waited, observed, understood what silence meant between two anxious breaths over the radio. One afternoon, a new hire named Seth had a panic attack mid-call. I sat beside him, didn't say much. I just breathed with him until the worst passed. Afterward, he said, "You make people feel like it's okay to pause." I nodded. I'd spent years learning that for myself. In early July, Dad received a call from a mutual friend who still spoke with my mother from time to time. Apparently, she was working at a consignment boutique in another part of the state. The house she'd once filled with throw pillows and curated displays had been sold in a quiet off-market deal. The car she used to detail weekly was repossessed. Chloe, from what we gathered, was renting a studio apartment with thin walls and working freelance editing for a chain of travel influencers. There were no lawsuits, no scandals in the papers, just two women fading gently into the very ordinariness they had always judged others for. I didn't feel triumphant. If anything, I felt something more grounded, a kind of justice that required no audience. They had built a structure on a foundation of denial, and it had quietly collapsed under its own weight, not because I pushed it, but because truth doesn't bend forever without breaking. One Saturday morning, Olivia and I reorganized the storage closet in the hallway. Among the coats and forgotten board games, I found a small box labeled Winter 2020. Inside were holiday cards from old coworkers, a few candles, and a Polaroid photo I'd completely forgotten. It was from the first year I had moved out on my own. I was standing in front of a half-decorated tree, holding a mug, laughing at something off camera. I looked peaceful, even if I didn't remember feeling that way at the time. I framed it and placed it on the shelf by the entryway. Not as nostalgia, but as evidence that I had always been building something, even when I didn't know it. That evening, Dad found me standing in front of the photo. He asked what I was thinking. I said, I think I was already starting to leave. Even back then, he didn't question it. He just said, sometimes leaving isn't about walking away. It's about refusing to keep pretending. I nodded. We both knew how long we'd pretended. Too long. The next day, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. It read, Tyson passed away last week. Chloe thought you'd want to know. She's not doing well. I stared at the message for a long time. There was no name attached, no context, just those few sentences, like an invitation to feel something. But I didn't feel grief, not even anger, just a kind of dull ache for how things had been misplaced. Love, attention, concern offered so freely to a dog, withheld so consistently from a daughter. I didn't reply. I didn't delete the message either. I let it sit there, unread, like a stone on a shelf. It wasn't closure. It wasn't a bridge. It was just information. And for once, that was enough. That night, while we were cleaning up after dinner, I told Dad about the message. He didn't flinch. He just said, "I hope Chloe finds whatever she's looking for," I said. "I hope she learns to look in the right direction." He placed a plate into the drying rack and said, "You did everything you could, for all of them." I nodded. Now I'm doing everything for me. There's something quiet and profound about building a life you don't need to explain to anyone. A life that doesn't beg for permission or chase validation. A life where survival isn't just about making it through, but about choosing what's worth carrying forward and what's better left behind. I had stopped carrying shame. I had stopped carrying silence. What I held now were things I had chosen with intention: a tea kettle, a photo, a phone number I never called. And somehow, in the middle of all that simplicity, I realized that peace doesn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like waking up and knowing you're not waiting for anyone to prove they care. The last time I passed by my childhood home, it was nearly dusk. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the yard overgrown, the windows shuttered. A for sale sign stood crooked at the edge of the lawn, and there was a deep crack in the driveway where we used to draw chalk outlines of hopscotch games that no one ever finished. I didn't stop. I didn't take a photo. I just kept driving. Window down, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other holding a coffee I hadn't touched. There was nothing to revisit. No version of that house could offer something I hadn't already grieved and released. Back home, Olivia had left a note taped to the fridge that simply said, "Dinner's on the stove. Hope today was light." I smiled at that word, light. Not good, not easy, just light, like something you could carry without breaking. I heated the soup she'd made and sat at the kitchen table while the sun dipped behind the rooftops. Dad was out of town visiting a friend, and the apartment was still. I liked that kind of silence now. It no longer felt like absence. It felt earned. Later that night, I opened my laptop and reread the letter I had written but never sent. It was addressed to my mother. I had written it during recovery. In the early days when everything still stung like an open wound, I had poured myself into it every unanswered question, every moment of disbelief, every time I begged for love and received logistics instead. I had sealed it once, even placed a stamp on the envelope, but something had stopped me from mailing it, and now, reading it again, I knew why. It wasn't for her. It was for me. I tore it in half, not out of spite, but out of completion. It had done its job. I didn't need it anymore. That weekend, we hosted a small dinner on the back porch. Just a few people, Olivia, some colleagues from the department, a neighbor who'd recently gone through a loss of her own. We ate simply, nothing curated or arranged. At some point, someone brought out an old Bluetooth speaker and played songs from the early 2000s that none of us remembered the lyrics to. I watched the people I now called family laugh, pass food, refill each other's drinks without being asked. It felt like a scene from someone else's memory. But I was inside it now, not watching from the side. I belonged here not because I was useful, not because someone needed something, but because I was simply enough. Before midnight, Olivia handed me a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "Open it tomorrow," she said. "Not now. I promised I would." The next morning, I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a framed photo of the three of us, me, Dad, and her standing in the middle of our now fully grown herb garden. We looked sun-tired and content, not posed, not filtered, just real along the bottom. She had written one line in black ink. It said, "You didn't lose them. They lost the chance to know you." I placed it on the bookshelf, next to the compass pendant she had given me months earlier. I didn't cry. I didn't even pause. I just stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet strength of everything that hadn't broken. It's strange how healing can feel both ordinary and miraculous at the same time, how survival doesn't announce itself with trumpets or speeches, but with small, consistent choices that say, "I will not disappear." On the anniversary of the accident, I went back to the intersection. I didn't plan to. I was on my way home from work, and my car slowed without thinking. The light turned red, and I waited. Across the street stood a man with a bag of groceries and a child tugging at his coat. The light turned green, and they crossed safely. I took a deep breath and drove on. No flashbacks, no weight in my chest, just movement. Back home, I sat at my desk and opened a blank document. I didn't know what I would write next, but I knew I wasn't finished. The story that began with a betrayal no longer needed to end there. It had become something else, something stronger, quieter, and more honest than anything I had ever known before. People always say healing isn't linear. I believe that. But I also believe that if you keep walking, even slowly, even when it hurts, you eventually end up somewhere that doesn't look like pain, somewhere that feels like peace. And once you get there, even if you carry the scars, you realize that the life you built around them is still whole. My name is Emma Watson. And if you ask me now whether I ever needed to hear sorry, I'd say no. What I needed was to remember I was never the problem. I was just the one who stayed silent too long. What about you? Who are you when you finally stop waiting to be chosen?